Hello everyone and welcome back to this new Beyond the Board. So here I am, accompanied here by AJChimaera. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello there, I'm AJChimaera. I'm a streamer and content creator from New Zealand.
And so would you like to talk about what it is that you speedrun, especially with Subnautica?
Yeah, so Subnautica, I primarily speedrun. I also speedrun some of the truck simulator games and have tried my hand at a couple of others.
So how have you gotten into Subnautica speedrunning and for how long have you been doing that?
So originally I played Subnautica back when it was in early access, and then after it got released I waited a while before playing it properly and kind of played my way through it and finished the game, but kind of fumbled my way through some of the late game sections. Fairly sure that I didn't do it properly, so I didn't use like the Cyclops or Prawn suits, which are the late game vehicles. So I checked up on YouTube for walkthroughs or guides and came across some of the speedrun videos and found Clove's Hardcore Glitchless, which was the world record at the time. Found that I'd done some things similar to how they'd done it in the speedrun routing, much as they don't use the vehicles at all, and also learnt a lot of other things that were possible, so I was interested in trying it myself.
Since you've been mentioning there are so many things about Subnautica speedrunning, what are your favorite aspects of it and why?
It's really hard to pick just one favorite or anything. The process of the collecting the resources and doing all of the crafting is quite meditative in some ways. It's really just process based, so it's kind of like problem solving in many respects, and it's just a really nice game to play. It's a really pretty game, great graphics, and it's got a really good soundtrack.
Would you like to explain your background with bingos and Subnautica bingos?
Bingo itself was not something I associated with speedrunning at the time, because I only just got into speedrunning when I started running Subnautica. So after getting into it, I started watching Salvner in particular and his regular Subnautica any percent streams, and occasionally he'd do bingo races against Cactus, who's one of the other runners at the time. I'd been looking for other ways to play the game beyond just grinding the same categories again. The problem solving aspect of that definitely came into it. Bingo gave an outlet for that, a bit more freeform.
What is it that you think that makes Subnautica bingos fun?
Yeah, so compared to the normal speedrun, bingos are quite a different way of playing the game because it's a lot more freeform, and you do have that kind of on-the-fly problem solving. It's also a bit more like playing the game casually again, and most of us in the speedrunning community have always felt like if we could, we'd go back and play the game for the first time, and speedrunning the game is just a way of being able to play it more, just to enjoy that experience. And bingo lets you do a lot more exploration, and you see and make things that you normally wouldn't do in a normal run, and you get to enjoy those parts of the game.
In what do you think Subnautica bingos are the most challenging or engaging? Is it in routing, in execution, or anything else you might think of?
Yeah, so routing is definitely one of the biggest challenges. Like most speedrunning, you want to avoid a lot of double movement, but since it's a lot more freeform and a lot more open world, you need a lot more map knowledge than you normally do, and a good idea of what things you need to make and what goes into them so you can route more efficiently. And it's not always as simple as just going everywhere only once, depending on what your objectives are. There's definitely a lot of extra challenge to it. That's the other aspect of it, is once you start grinding the speed game to an extent, it starts to feel a little bit easy, a little bit just muscle memory, whereas jumping into bingo, and especially a blackout, that really makes you work again, and it really does give that extra challenge.
How complex is it to get that extra map knowledge that's very useful in bingo? Is it something that just comes naturally as players play, or is there anything specific they need to learn?
It's a bit of both, definitely. Depending on what your casual experience was, you may have encountered some things in that kind of seeg into bingo quite well compared to one of the any percent runs where we kind of skip out a lot of things. Otherwise, there's a lot of online resources that we've put together, or there's just the wiki that's mostly accurate in terms of learning where things are and what things are required. It's definitely observed that the more people have played the game, the more they'll get good at bingo, basically.
Are there any tricks or glitches that are not often seen in normal speedruns of Subnautica that are useful in bingos?
We make use of most of the same tricks. I don't think there's too many extra ones that we'd use, but we use them in more ways and in more places. Like one example is the clipping out of bounds with the mobile vehicle bay is a very common thing to use to cut corners, even in any percent. And we just do that in more places, and you learn spots on the map that if I clip out of bounds here in one of the shallower areas, I can just go straight down to one of the late game areas and get what I need. There's also a different strategy for flooding your base because there's a super sea glide glitch when you have a flooded base. Usually in any percent, most people just make a large base to make it flood. That's a lot slower. So in bingo, it's more common just to use some of the acid mushrooms in the shallows to flood your base in order to enable it much quicker. You're also more likely to use some of the funky physics glitches like item flight, where you can use the propulsion cannon to stand on something and make you fly, especially in blackout if you have to go to places that are above water. There's definitely a few things that we use, and remote storage is another one where we can expand our inventory capacity briefly, and that becomes really crucial in something like bingo in order to gather everything that you need without having to do extra trips.
How does Subnautica's open world and survival elements affect bingos and how they're played? I mean, especially if you're thinking, for example, of how you manage the oxygen meter. How do you deal with that in the context of a bingo?
Yeah, oxygen obviously most important when you're in an underwater game. A lot of the time, because we use the super sea glide, that gives you so much more time on target, so you don't have to worry about running out of air quite as often. But if you've got objectives that take you much deeper, you can just construct a base and do a death reset and you get all of your oxygen back. But if you were using super sea glide, you lose that, so you've got a bit of a trade-off there. Or you have to have a propulsion cannon to easily flood the base in order to get it back, so there's those sorts of considerations, and whether it's worth the time it takes to do that, or whether you should just make a spare oxygen tank or some other way of getting extra oxygen. Other open world considerations are like the different places that you go for resources, and that can also tie into your kind of oxygen management strategy. It's a case of, well, instead of going to this place way over here that's 500 meters down, I can go to this other place that's just up here and it's only 200 meters down, and I can also get this, that, and the other thing on the way, for example. Otherwise, the other survival elements like food and water and health are usually not as relevant because you can just do death resets quite frequently. And the other survival aspect essentially is the day-night cycle, especially in a single bingo where it's much shorter. You only have a couple of day periods within the run that you can take advantage of to get your base power up. So if you need to make a lot of things, you've got to be really keeping an eye on when the power is going to come back into your base. Otherwise, you just end up sitting there waiting 4 minutes for the next day cycle.
How would you deal with a situation where you realize you've done a misjudgment and you realize, oh, wait, I don't have enough oxygen. What do I do now?
Those times are scary. It can be tricky. I've had that a couple of times. Depending on how you've managed your inventory, the easiest thing to do is to just dump your stuff into your remote storage. There's a glitch that we use where you can access a locker storage from wherever you are on the map. By skipping the animation, it defers it until you next open your PDA. So we'll do that, and then before doing a death warp back to your life pod, dump everything into the locker, and then you go back and do whatever you were doing next. Because if you don't remember to dump your inventory and then drown, you lose it all. So it's just a case of keeping a clear head, dumping what you have, knowing that you've got to then come back.
What is it that constitutes a fun and engaging goal in the context of Subnautica versus one that you think might need some rebalancing?
I like goals that take me to different places in the map, ideally, so you do get that extra exploration element and have to make me think about what I'm going to have to do to make the most of the distance that I have to travel. The rebalancing ones, sometimes you get a goal, for example, that was to fill out an entire section of the databank, but you had to go to so many places that it just had too high of a minimum amount of time required in order to do all of those things. And sometimes you also get goals that will combo far too well with certain other things. It's a case of, well, if we added this, then this or this become free, essentially. You get kind of free squares because you have to do those in order to do this. We had quite a few discussions in the community when things like that arise to determine whether or not we change the easier goals in order to make the harder one better, or we've just had to get rid of a lot of the ones that we've previously had as harder goals because they've been too difficult and too far out of step with what the others do. And also other glitch discoveries and things like that sometimes change the ways in which things can be done. We try and make sure that all of the goals on the grids will always be able to be completed in glitchless runs as well as glitched, because we don't want to deny people who don't want to do glitched runs that experience as well. But sometimes that does drastically mean that the difficulty will be so much more in a glitchless versus glitched. So it's definitely an ongoing challenge.
So when it comes to routing, what are the aspects of it perhaps that most people would usually not think of, or at least that might not seem obvious? And are there any mistakes perhaps in the thought process behind routing that basically can quote unquote damage one's potential in bingo?
Yeah, it's definitely tricky. One of the things I think is it's too easy to think towards just a specific task that you're trying to do at the expense of others. So you don't do things efficiently because you're just trying to knock them one after the other. But obviously, to get better times, you're going to have to start thinking more efficiently about it. But you can also be trying to do too much at once. And sometimes that means more inefficient movement overall if you then have to work out inventory space or time factors or your oxygen levels, for example. It can ultimately be more efficient to just do a couple of different trips to two different places instead of trying to do everything all in one trip. And in terms of the time factors, especially, there's some objectives that you hatch some of the creature eggs that are on the map. Those take 20 minutes each. And you don't want to be just sitting around for 5 minutes waiting for an egg to hatch, just as you don't want to be waiting around for power, like I mentioned earlier. So you want to get those sort of objectives started as soon as you possibly can, and then use that mandatory time that takes in order to do other things. So you might make what seems at the surface to be inefficient routing choices just to make sure that you get that objective started, but then it makes up for it because you're not wasting that time at the end just sitting, twiddling your thumbs, waiting for an egg to hatch.
What would you say is the barrier of entry for people who would be interested in picking up Subnautica bingos? And do you have any advice for them?
Yes, the main barrier is just the game knowledge in general, the map, where to find things, locations of things in relation to where you start, and also where they are in relation to each other, and also the alternatives. So having those backups. It takes a lot of practice still, and at the end of the day, the best advice is simply just to get in and play the game and just give it a go, because remember that any time is a good time. When you're starting out, we were all beginners once, we all make mistakes. We still sometimes make those beginner mistakes even when we're experienced at the game. Try not to concentrate too much on specific goals per se, because those keep changing. But more the general things like, say, landmarks to get from biome to biome as opposed to thing, and then you kind of break it down that, okay, I'm going from this biome to that biome. That biome has these things in it, instead of thinking I'm going from this thing to that thing, for example. But ultimately, it is just a case of bingo is a way to play how you like and do it in your own pace.
Do you think normal speedrunners could benefit from doing bingos in some way in the context of Subnautica?
I definitely think it can be a benefit. It depends on your motivation for running the game. Obviously, some people are more than happy to just jump into the game. They learn the specific category, execute it, grind it down, do it well, put a time on the board, and that's them. But once it gets to a certain point, the grind is quite stressful, and you find yourself actually not enjoying your time as much. And bingo is a way to kind of break that up. And it's a welcome break from doing that grind, and it helps to remind you of why you fell in love with the game in the first place. There's also the fact that practicing just efficient movement and crafting is something that's always useful, and it can also help to challenge your current thinking of other categories. It just gives you a different perspective on the game, and it can help to break those open with new routing suggestions or new ways of doing things.
How do you think the community can further support bingos?
Well, we still run our fortnightly league, which is a good way to get in, because even as a beginner, you can watch along, basically just try and do what they do. So it's a great way to just get started. Best thing as a community we can do is just to support people who want to get involved. As I said before, just the reassurance that any time is a good time. If you are just getting started and you complete a run, whether it's on normal categories or in bingo, you've done a good thing. Because you've already done more than what a lot of people have done. You've dedicated yourself to doing something, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Getting started is the most important thing. It's just a case of, well, watch someone else's video on the category that you want and just do it.
Have you got any final words you'd like to say to the community?
Just thanks for being such a great community, really. I think we've been really quite open and pretty generous. There's always someone online to bounce ideas off, really. There's been a lot of people getting involved lately, maybe because Below Zero, the sequel's coming out soon, so there's been a lot of interest in the Subnautica space. There's lots of new discoveries that people keep making to break the game further. So it's a great time to get involved. And it's just, yeah, thanks for everyone. It's been a good support place over the last few years.
All right, thank you so much. Well, that will conclude our Beyond the Board here. So definitely make sure to give Chimera a follow on Twitch, as well as if you really are interested in getting involved with Subnautica speedrunning and bingos, to check out the Subnautica speedrunning Discord, as well as the speedrun.com page. Thank you everyone, and we'll be seeing you on the next Beyond the Board.
Thank you.